Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody that has made time to join this session. And I'd like to welcome you all. As you all know, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has accentuated the enormous role of digitalization of the economies. Digital connectivity is now seen obviously as an absolute must-have for citizens and businesses when physical interaction is terribly constrained as it is today. This means that countries in the region with a resilient mobile network and better quality of service will definitely be at a very good advantage in the post-COVID economic recovery stages. Today's session is going to look at how implementing licensing best practice can have a positive impact on closing the digital divide and also helping in promoting better access to and provision of broadband services. The session is going to cover a couple of areas. I have a set of very good speakers. We're going to have a speaker from the GSMA speak on spectrum licensing best practices. We're going to also share some views on the global case studies of spectrum policies. And then there will be a session with one of the major regional mobile network operators to provide a perspective of theirs on licensing in the region and what kind of impact it has on the delivery of mobile broadband services in the region. After that, we're going to also have a Q&A session where we'll be taking questions from the audience and also be able to answer some of the questions and respond to some of the deliveries that audience might have picked up from the presentations and also from the MNO speaking. So if we could go on to the first slide, please. Thank you very much. So our first speaker is Caroline Mbugua. Caroline is with the GSMA Sub-Saharan Africa Policy Team. She sits in the Nairobi office and has responsibility for covering policy issues for the GSMA in the East Africa region. Prior to joining the GSMA, Caroline also had many years with Safaricom, where she handled a lot of regulatory-related issues as well. So Caroline, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you for the introduction. Distinguished delegates, all protocols observed, good afternoon. As Kamal mentioned, my name is Caroline Mbugua, Senior Policy Manager, Sub-Saharan Africa at the GSMA. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you and to take part in this very important forum. I will start with a quick overview of who we are. If we can just move on to the next slide, thank you. So the GSMA has been in operation for over 30 years and has offices across the globe, around 12 offices across the world. We are an industry association that represents the interests of mobile operators worldwide, uniting more than 750 operators with almost 400 companies in the broader mobile ecosystem. We work to positively influence the delivery of a regulatory environment that creates value for consumers by engaging regularly with regulators, policymakers, and other stakeholders globally. The GSMA is also known to produce the industry-leading events Mobile World Congress, best known as MWC, events annually in Barcelona, Los Angeles, Shanghai, and among other events which attract over 130 people from across the globe. When moving on to the next slide, so as Kamal has mentioned, during the current period of COVID-19 pandemic, broadband connectivity has proven to be indispensable in supporting a functioning economy and in addressing the health emergency brought about by the pandemic. In compliance with the measures put in place by various governments across the region in order to reduce the spread of the virus, consumers continue to leverage broadband connectivity to stay connected even in a socially distant world. We continue to see that countries with more robust ICT infrastructure, resilient broadband networks, high internet penetration and adoption have performed better in coping with the challenges brought by the pandemic. I believe the transformative power of broadband services and as an enabler for economic and social growth makes it an essential tool for empowering people, creating an environment that nurtures the technological and service innovation and triggering positive changes in business processes as well as in the society as a whole. If you look at this slide that is currently on the screen, and in relation to what I just discussed, I'd like to discuss a quick snapshot of 4G in the region. As of June 2020, there are 177 live 4G networks in Sub-Saharan Africa. 25 of these networks were launched in the last 18 months, that is since January 2019, including for the first time Burkina Faso, Cape Verde, Guinea, and Niger. There are about 90 million 4G connections in Sub-Saharan Africa, equivalent to just under 11% of the total mobile connections. More of these details will be provided in the new mobile economy report that will be launched next month during Thrive Africa event. I encourage all of you to look out for this particular publication. Speaking to the transformative power of broadband connectivity in the region I mentioned earlier, we believe the region is currently in the right direction, but however, a lot more needs to be done to be able to encourage increased investment in 4G to support fast and reliable internet connection in the region. Moving on to the next slide, please. As mentioned, we encourage policymakers and regulators to adopt policy reforms that support the rollout of broadband networks and increase adoption of the same in order to unlock the true value of broadband connectivity. This can be done by addressing some existing license challenges that I'd like to run through as outlined on this particular slide. And to begin with, I'd like to talk about availing spectrum in the right amounts at the right time, reasonably priced, and of course, not forgetting it should encompass coverage and capacity bands, and of course also to look at existing and future bands. This is a very important thing because we all understand that spectrum is the key resource that drives broadband connectivity and drives connectivity in the region. This is best done through a spectrum roadmap that is developed in consultation with key stakeholders in the ecosystem and including mobile network operators. The other issue is regulatory certainty, which is important to attract and retain long-term investment in connectivity. We all understand that connectivity is well related to high capital investment, and investors need to be certain of spectrum allocation methodologies, license renewal procedures, and projects and programs that governments are focused on so that influence spectrum availability in the future. Regulators need to think through the licensing renewal process. Towards the end of a license term, operators are unlikely to invest substantially unless they have a clear sign that the license is going to be renewed. In our view as a GSMA, the renewal process should begin in around 3 to 4 years before the expiry of the license, so operators don't ease down on investment. The whole process should be predictable, therefore major changes in the terms and conditions of the license should be avoided as much as possible. In the next slide, I'd like to delve a bit more on pricing. Last year as a GSMA, we looked at pricing in developing market, and as you can see on this slide, spectrum prices are significantly higher in developing markets when income levels are taken into account. By factoring income, we got a better sense of affordability. Final prices were around 3 times higher in developing markets compared to developed markets. And we observed the reserve prices are 3 times higher than in developing markets compared to developed markets. An interesting fact that we observed is that high spectrum fees are found to be linked to countries with high level of short-term national sovereign debt. In addition, it is observation that high spectrum fees and low amounts of spectrum results to low quality of services and higher prices for the consumer in the long run. A scenario that leads to low adoption of broadband services in the region. And our research shows that as a 2019 usage gap in the region, and the usage gap is described as the number of people that are covered by broadband connectivity but are not connected due to various issues, was 51%, which translates to 550 million in Sub-Saharan Africa region that are covered by broadband services and are not connected. And one of the key issues that lead to this usage gap being high is, of course, the issue of affordability. So availing spectrum in the right amounts and in the right prices has a direct relation to affordability of service to the consumer in the long run. The level of annual fee also needs to be set carefully. It is wise to have some annual fees to offset the cost of regulating the network. However, we have seen high spectrum cost sinks limiting network investment and driving up consumer prices. We are currently working on a spectrum pricing report for Africa as the GSMA that will be published later in the year. I encourage you all to look out for this important publication that will provide more information on spectrum pricing in the region. Next slide, please. As we look at the potential areas of focus in the region, and regulators need to use license terms and conditions to encourage operators to invest more in their networks and thus improve services and coverage and quality of service. For example, operators can make a return on a 10-year spectrum license in highly populated areas, but in rural areas, they may struggle to make a return on their investment within the time frame. Longer license periods, such as those lasting 10 years or 15 years, are recommended in order to encourage significant investment in infrastructure everywhere, including the rural areas. Another issue is technology neutrality of spectrum license, where some license conditions restrict the technology operators can deploy, often to 2G only. This holds back mobile broadband rollout and limits competition, as operators cannot roll out 2G and 3G using this spectrum. We encourage regulators and operators to embrace a technology-neutral licensing framework that will unlock the true value of spectrum as a finite resource. And as I conclude, coverage obligations can be useful conditions for ensuring widespread of mobile services, but they must be used carefully. If regulators create extremely wide coverage obligations, they can push consumer prices up because the obligations would be very expensive to meet. Alternatively, operators, just a slide. Alternatively, operators may be forced to restrict investment in urban areas where mobile services are most in demand to finance rural networks investment. As such, coverage obligations should be best set with great care and in consultation with operators. Furthermore, they should be factored into the price of spectrum, as expensive spectrum coupled up with extensive coverage obligations are likely to be a recipe of failure. In conclusion, rather than filling license with a variety of onerous terms and conditions, it is normally best to rely on market competition to improve customer outcomes. Onerous conditions can increase cost and restrict operators' ability to invest in their network and innovate. As you can see on this slide, the issue of also regulatory certainty is key in license terms and conditions. And regulatory certainty, as we have observed in the previous slide, looks into encouraging investment and high investment, if I may say it like that, because of that certainty that in the long run, the license period is for a period that would guarantee return on investment for the operators. And of course, that would encourage the kind of investment that is expected in this particular sector. I would like to pause there, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to respond to them at the point where we are looking at the question and answer session. And with no further ado, I'd like to welcome my colleague Peng Zhao, the Senior Spectrum Director, who will discuss the global case studies on Spectrum Awards. Welcome, Peng.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you for the introduction. As Caroline introduced, my name is Peng Zhao. I'm a Senior Spectrum Director within GSMA. I'm based in London, the headquarters of GSMA. So for today, for my presentation, I plan to complete a little bit the presentation that Caroline just did before, with a few kind of international experience, international case studies, just to illustrate the different kind of recommendations and best practice that Caroline shared in her presentation. So just a few countries as a concrete example, so you can pick and choose, the relevant part for you. As we all know, every single market is different. Circumstance and context for spectrum management will be different. But we just want to flag a few kind of good aspects from various spectrum license auctions that we've seen recently. So if you want to move to the next slide, please. So the first one I want to flag to you is the Finland 5G spectrum auction. Finland and the Nordics in general has always been quite in the forefront of the mobile technology. They were the first one to launch 4G in the past, and Finland is also one of the first one who licensed 5G spectrum. So just want to share some of the the facts there first. 2 years ago, they auctioned 3.5 gigahertz, and they in fact provided 390 megahertz of spectrum for 5G for the different kind of for the three operators. But each of them have obtained 130 megahertz each. So if you look at the different kind of publication from ITU, but also from GSA and ourselves, GSMA, we always promoted to have at least 80 to 100 megahertz of spectrum, contiguous spectrum per operator for 5G in this, but this one is clearly going over and above that, and because they are aiming for the best network possible. They did a similar thing for millimeter wave with 800 megahertz just recently. They provided 800 megahertz contiguous for each of the operators. But one other aspect of that auction, of those two auctions, is the price. If you look at the price, I mean, you might know or might not know Finland as a market, as a mobile market, but they have quite high ARPU. So they have like 19 euros per connection, or per unique subscriber is 36 euros per connection. So the revenue is fairly healthy for the mobile operators. So when you compare that to the price they paid for the license, you can clearly see that the policy goal for the government was not to to get as much money as possible, but really to get the spectrum out there and to give operators enough funding left to deploy the network. So I think that's the key thing that we want to flag here. If we want to move to the next one, please. Next slide. Yeah, really quick one. This one is more New Zealand is more a kind of the flexibility from the regulator in front of the COVID-19. I think New Zealand has planned for a few years already to have an auction on the 5G this year, but because of the pandemics, they said, okay, instead of going for the auction and to get all the money back as much money as possible, the goal was really just go for the kind of to get the spectrum out as quickly as possible, so that mobile operator can use it to deploy and increase the capacity on the network. So it's changed really swiftly from auction to administrative assignment at a really reserve price. And the spectrum has been deployed really quickly a couple of months after the assignment. So that's every single citizen is benefiting from the spectrum nowadays. Can we move to the next slide, please? So another example is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has had a really kind of in recent years had a really a big push to improve the mobile broadband connectivities, and they have auctioned several different bands in succession, as you see on the screen here, between 2017 and 2019, and it's a really a lot of kind of spectrum that they provided for mobile operators, and as the end result of this is that if you can just click on next, please, Lula, is that Saudi Arabia as a market was not that advanced as a 4G market back in 2016, 2017, but right now today it is the best 5G market in terms of speed and in terms of connectivity across the whole world. So they're even above the usual suspects like South Korea or Australia, who were really advanced in the 4G market era, and now they bypass them. And the reason is that really, how much the spectrum they have been allocating to each of the mobile operators. So if you can see on 2.3, 2.6, and 3.5, across this, all the operators, each of the operators had access to over at least 200 megahertz basically of spectrum additionally to implement their new networks. So it is really the amount and contiguous amount of this was as a key aspect I wanted to flag with the Saudi. Next, please. So the next two kind of case study and last case study was to address a bit the other aspect of spectrum licensing. Of course, pricing and performance is good, but as for the topics and the whole thematic of today's Forum Global session is about connectivity, I wanted to share with you, two examples of operators and regulator who work together to get, one is to get the spectrum policy right, but also to get the investment business case right to reach out to more population and to cover a wider area. So the first one is UK. UK this year, the 4 UK mobile operators have signed up a share rural network project, which will guarantee a lot of investment to extend the coverage. So within that project, they have agreement between them to voluntarily share some of the base station, but also, and the most important, is where the investment will come from. So if you see on the figure there, approximately 50% of the investment are committed by the mobile operators. But there's also 50% that's coming from the UK government's funding. And UK government said they will be using some of the spectrum auction proceed to complete that thing. So it is a joint effort, and the aim is to reach 95% of the geographical area within the next few years until 2026. If you move to the last slide for me, please. Thank you very much. So, and the other one, another way to address that is from France. So France, instead of saying that's a joint kind of a funding, they said, okay, mobile operators have to renew their license in 900, 1800, and 2.1 from the 2G or 3G auction that they had 20 years ago. But operators, but the regulator there said, okay, instead of having the operator pay again for the spectrum, coverage is probably the one thing that we want them to address the most. So they delimited a few kind of rural areas and road and all the unconnected area to say, okay, if operator you can cover those areas, then you will have a much reduced renewal fees. And again, it is something that is fairly good. So operator, instead of using that money to pay for spectrum, and the spectrum is gets elsewhere outside of the industry, they will use that money to deploy base stations and to reach rural areas that didn't have the kind of a business case to cover before. So it is a really clever usage of the coverage obligations, and it is a win-win-win situation for both the regulators who manage to attain the policy goal. It is a win for the mobile operators who has enough funding to deploy in the real area, but it's certainly a win for the consumers. So with that, I think that was the few examples I want to give today. I'm open to more questions. But of course, the last two examples I give today on France and UK, they are in fact part of a big kind of coverage paper that we just launched today. If you move to our exhibition area later on, you will see this a link to those various studies, but including these very new studies, and they include a lot of kind of details about those case studies I just mentioned. So with that, I would like to pass back to Kamal for the rest of the session. Thank you.
Kamal, you're on mute, just to let you know.
Apologies, Anna. I said so much good stuff, and I'm not aware. I'm not sure I can repeat everything I just. Anyways, thanks again, Peng and Carol, for the interesting perspectives. Caroline, you shared with us some interesting challenges around licensing and some of the areas that a good licensing framework should consider, and also some of the perspectives in terms of spectrum pricing. And Peng also shared some very good perspectives in terms of case studies from other markets that have dabbled in this area of spectrum pricing. My next guest is from one of the major regional MNOs in Sub-Saharan Africa. Shergen is with Vodacom, which is a leading African communications company that provides a wide range of communication services, including data, mobile and fixed voice, messaging, financial services, enterprise IT, and converged services to more than 115 million customers, including Kenya and Safaricom customers as well. Vodacom has grown its mobile network business from Southern African roots to include operations in Tanzania, the DRC, Mozambique, Lesotho, and also in Kenya. And its mobile network covers a total population of over 289 million people. And through Vodacom Business, they also offer business managed services to enterprises in 51 countries across the region. Vodacom is majority owned by Vodafone, one of the world's largest communications companies by revenue. So thank you very much, Shergen, for agreeing to join this panel. I know you've been quite active throughout the conference, and it's good to always be able to have your time so that we can benefit from your experience as well from the region.
Thank you, Kamal, and thank you for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here.
Thank you. So with the fact that Vodacom has a presence in all of these countries, all of them different in the local context, in the way the markets are regulated, in the way that spectrum is managed, and also you being a very prominent stakeholder in the conversation around spectrum management in the Sub-Saharan Africa region. What are your views on some of the good spectrum licensing practices you might have seen in the region? How have these practices had an impact on the way you operate and deliver mobile broadband services to the citizens of the region? And what has been the consequence of these positive impacts on your consumers and also on the customers?
Thanks, Kamal. I think it's quite a lengthy question. I'll try to summarize and answer in sort of the most key points. In essence, based on our experience and under normal circumstances, and I highlight that because it's not in crisis situations like the pandemic, which requires perhaps a different look at the licensing procedures. But we believe that in our experiences, spectrum auctions remain the best mechanism to license high demand spectrum, like INT spectrum. And the reason for this is because it ensures that the scarce resources are actually licensed both transparently and importantly to those who will value it the most, which is fundamentally important because you want to make sure that the spectrum goes to the licensees that will put the largest investments behind it to make it work for those communities. And importantly, auctions can also be tweaked and designed with special rules to make sure that they meet the desired objectives of government or regulators. And this brings to mind, the Tanzania 700 megahertz auction, which we had a few years back, as a very good example, because the government set out very clearly its objectives, that its priority was digital inclusion. And so what it did is it attached quite ambitious, in fact, very, very ambitious rollout obligations to the licenses that were up for offer. And it also then carefully calculated that appropriate reserve prices would be necessary in order to allow for people to bid and put investments behind it, and also to attach this to longer license terms to make it worthwhile for investors and operators to be interested to get those licenses. And what it also did was it went on an extensive proper consultation with industry to develop the rules, the comprehensive auction rules, and make sure that the rules had been thought through well enough to ensure that the auction was highly successful. So I think this was one of the very, very good examples. I just want to highlight, looking at Peng's slides, he mentioned things about population coverage. In the Tanzania case, the coverage obligations were set at 2021 to achieve 60% population coverage on 4G at substantial quality of service speeds. And in addition to that, it was 90% population coverage by 2024. And we we've gone extensively to throw massive amounts of investments to accelerate our population coverage on 4G. We started at that time of about 9%, 10% population coverage, and today we sit well on track in target. So, and it's been an awfully difficult challenge. It was very, very ambitious. But having said that, it was a carefully balanced, thought-through rule that was applied on the auction that was designed for Tanzania. So essentially, I think what I'm saying is that longer license terms are preferable, and we would really prefer them to be at least 20 years. 15 years is really the bare minimum, and 20 years, 25 years is what we think is logical to ensure that it's investment friendly. It gives us an element of certainty that we could commit to larger investments in a particular market. And we also note that delivering capacity and the level of service that is now demanded by customers or mobile customers, it just simply requires billion-dollar investments in very carefully designed nationwide mobile networks. And furthermore, as part of supporting investment certainty, spectrum regulation must simply provide for exclusive national use of spectrum, and importantly, free from harmful interference. And I say this because it's important for me to highlight that, I've heard through this conference that, there's a lot of talk about sharing spectrum, but I would like to caution that, implementing sharing of IMT with another service like broadcasting in the same geographic and time domain would simply not work. And that will prevent the delivery of quality of service and fundamentally, consequently devalue the spectrum, because operators will not be willing to pay and acquire that spectrum to use, only to find out that it is being interfered with by another service. So these are careful considerations that regulators need to consider. Also, significant investments in mobile network rollout has a wide range of positive impacts to end users that are realized through the social upliftment and overall economic gain in the country. We've seen a number of new innovative solutions being created thanks to mobile in the markets we've operated. And I'm going to summarize this very quickly in the sense that I'm going to quote the GSMA's 2019 mobile economy report, which indicates that the mobile industry contributed 8.6% in 2018, $144 billion to GDP. And this is forecasted to grow further to 185 billion by 2025. So all of this comes from, being able to create opportunities through mobile for people to conduct business, economic activities, social upliftment, connectivity. And these are fundamentally realized in economic value and social value. In summary, I'd like to highlight that the opportunity cost of misallocating spectrum and undermining that investment opportunity is just far too great to leave to chance. And this is why for more than 30 years, mobile spectrum has been awarded to operators through competitive tender or auction, where the return of certainty of access to the spectrum, licensees will then only agree to investment commitments. I hope that kind of covers the answer. I hope it wasn't too long.
Thank you very much, Shergan. We were risking running a little bit out of time. So maybe the next question will be a lot shorter. What do you reckon are some of the areas of spectrum licensing practices that you think could be improved upon? I know you mentioned quite a few in your current delivery, but perhaps maybe this is an opportunity to further sort of expatiate on those. If they are not improved upon, what effect do you think these sorts of areas can have on operators and on consumers as well?
Yeah, look, I think indeed there are definitely areas for improvement in our region, in the markets that we operate in. Very, very quickly, these include setting very high reserve prices, in spectrum auctions, a failure to create long-term investment certainty, shorter license terms, prohibiting technology neutrality, and strangely enough, extensive delays to license spectrum on an ongoing basis is a prevailing issue that we still encounter. One particular example we've had is where an authority decided to renege on the price of a license that it had issued in the midst of the license term. And the reality is that this type of practice is simply counterproductive to attracting and promoting further investments, as it creates far too much of uncertainty for an investor. We also see a reluctance to license spectrum on a technology neutrality basis in some markets. This results in a failure. I know that Caroline mentioned this, but I want to give you a point of view from the operator. This really results in a failure for us to bring newer technologies and services to market timeously, and this is then aligned to consumer needs in that particular market. And where further costs attached to this sort of licensing, it dilutes the important investments that need to expand and upgrade the network and introduce the newer technologies, all of which ultimately negatively impact the market and consumers in general. So these licensing practices need a review as they effectively act against the best interests of consumers, for varying reasons.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. So I suppose maybe it's impossible to go through this entire thing without mentioning 5G, especially for the fact that Vodacom was one of the first operators in the region to launch commercial 5G with your network in Lesotho. I think you switched on in later 2018, and then South Africa as well has recently come up on the map as well. So looking to the future, how much more different do you think licensing practices will need to be to make 5G a reality and become a lot more beneficial to the region? Do you reckon that there are any specific areas of current licensing practices that need significant overhaul to make 5G a reality?
Yeah, I do think in some particular cases, firstly, it's important that we ensure that the authorities make serious inroads to adopt and implement a very harmonized, globally harmonized, preferably, an appropriate band plan for the pioneer 5G spectrum bands. We see a lot of, we've had a lot of discussion at this conference as well, where we see a lot of narrow fragmented licensing in the C-band. And these are also pending migration from FDD to TDD in some cases. And we need appropriate band planning that will see operators have the right amount of spectrum to build a proper, performance 5G networks. And which also speaks to making available, the upper part of the C-band, which is the 3600 to 3800 megahertz for IMT. And this must take into account the number of licensees in the markets in Africa and or Sub-Saharan African markets. Then we would also like to encourage authorities to make more progress with the licensing itself. These pioneer bands, sometimes they just remain pending licensing. And they should be done on a technology agnostic basis, as we've mentioned, to provision for potential licensing also in broad channels. And we've spoken about this before in other sessions, but we strongly believe that 80 to 100 megahertz is the preference. Of course, auctions are designed in different block sizes and stuff, but that's the target that operators would need to get for us to build a proper performance network in 5G. And for this licensing, under normal circumstances, we recommend adopting a spectrum auction, for the reasons I've mentioned before, based on international best practice, pragmatic reserve prices, well-designed rules, extensive consultation, that kind of stuff. We would also like to ask the authorities to revisit annual spectrum fees. Because these fee models are sometimes very exorbitant, and they place a significant amount of burden for that act counterproductively towards investing towards infrastructure. So the per megahertz cost of licensing on annual fees should be reviewed with the intention to reduce that, and they should also be based on administrative incentive pricing models, so that they are appropriately priced in terms of propagation and use factors and geographic use, etc., etc.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Shergan. And we'll be looking through the Q&A session to see if there are any questions for yourself and for the rest of the panel. So perhaps maybe we can go quickly to the Q&A session, and I would like to bring on the other presenters as well, so that we can go through some of the questions. I think speaking specifically to Peng's question, there was one question which sought to ask that given what Saudi Arabia has achieved in mid-bands, why can't other countries in Africa follow the same examples, especially in refarming in the 2.3, 2.6, and 3.5 gigahertz bands? Peng, what are your thoughts? Because you did present the example from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I think there's several factors. As I mentioned before, the context can be different. For example, Saudi has not licensed 2.3 and 2.6 before, whereas in a lot of market in Africa, I believe 2.3 and 2.6 has been already licensed for LTE or some other WiMAX system. So it is a matter of looking at those licenses and see whether what's kind of the license term and conditions, whether to revoke them. But the other important thing is to say that those band has been in Saudi at least has been given to one operator each. So they have one operator who occupies the whole 2.3, so 100 megas on contiguous. Same on 2.6. And so on 3.5, they each had 100 megas, and one of the operator had 200 megas. So it is really, if you look at it, it is possible to do that. Certainly, please do it. That's one of the give you one of the best performance. But I think you really need each of the regulators need to look at their own circumstances.
Maybe this question would be best suited to be answered by Carol. It's related to technology neutrality, as you did mention that in your presentation. In many countries, spectrum is licensed to an operator without tying license to a particular technology, for example, 4G or 3G or anything else. But in some cases, license terms hold the operator to use license spectrum to deploy a particular technology only. Carol, which one do you reckon, which approach do you think is better, especially in view of spectrum harmonization? Carol, you're muted, so maybe you might need to unmute your mic.
Yeah, I did. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So that's
maybe
a great
keep
question.
your intervention as well under a minute, please, or 2 minutes, so that we can,
Okay. So as I just discussed, so spectrum is a very limited resource, and government and operators, of course, look to the most efficient way of utilizing spectrum. So looking at scenarios where you issue spectrum licenses and conditions that are technology neutral, this is a way that governments that want to, customers and businesses in their country to benefit from the best possible mobile broadband experience support of technology neutral and spectrum licenses is a must. And telecommunication industry as a whole is one that experiences a lot of disruptions, including changing consumer behaviors, and technology neutrality lets operators replace, for example, GSM with 4G and soon 5G in a particular frequency band. So, and also allows them to be flexible enough to respond to the changing consumer needs and, of course, the changes in technology that are happening in this particular industry. So, spectrum, technology neutral spectrum and the spectrum license conditions allow for the better use and efficient utilization of this finite resource. So, for me, I would encourage that both the license itself and the conditions embrace a technology agnostic approach.
Yeah, all right, thank you very much. Shagan, in your presentation, towards the end, you did mention the need for operators to be able to access 80 to 100 megahertz in the C-band spectrum particularly. So this question probably to you, in markets, for instance, where you have like 3 operators, is there a need for operators to have up to access to 400 megahertz of spectrum in those bands? And is there a risk of giving them that level of access to the value of spectrum in the region? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I know we're running out of time. I think first and foremost, the reference to 3 mobile operators is rather optimistic. In the markets that we operate, we experience even up to 14 licensees that have access to spectrum. That's the first and foremost part. And the second part is that if you include the 33 to 3400, you have to consider that there will be a guard band that has to be placed on the bottom part of the band to protect radar. That means there's not a full 100 megahertz that's indeed available there, number one. And number two is that in the segment from 34 to 36, that spectrum has already been long licensed. I mean, it's licensed to many operators that use it for 4G today on a fixed wireless access basis or on a mobile basis. And that spectrum is utilized to operators who have licenses and are operating and providing services to people. So the reality is that all of these factors need to be taken into account when one says that, that spectrum is there. There's a need for spectrum to actually accommodate for those licensees what's actually really available. And the fact is that it's generally far more than 3 mobile operators in the markets. That's the first part. And then, I mean, on that basis, that the second part of the question is doesn't make much difference, right? Because you manage that through the spectrum auction and reserve prices and the way you would like to get spectrum to be licensed. But if there's already more demand than there is supply, that problem doesn't exist.
All right, thanks a lot. Maybe the final question we'll be able to take in the time that we have. Peng, what do you reckon is going to be the most dominant mobile technology in the midterm future, 4G or 5G?
I think they will. I mean, from my perspective at least, I mean, I think both technology will coexist for a long time. Just like 2G and 3G has coexisted for many years, as they still coexist today in many markets. I think it is a evolution of the market, and I think market can define that, and it is quite key to look back what Caroline was saying, is that the technology neutrality is quite key. Mobile operator will see on the network, how many people are still on 3G or 4G or 5G, because you have to realize that running 2, 3, or 4 different parallel network can be really costly for the operator. So they need to be able to decide to switch off some of them. But I think at least 4G and 5G will be coexisting for a long while, until they depend on the continent, but at least for 4G, I don't see it going anywhere.
All right. Thank you very much for that feedback, Peng. And thank you very much to all of the panelists. I think it's been very interesting inputs and feedback you provided on licensing practices in the region. Some of the key points that I've picked out is the need to basically adopt technology neutral approaches to licensing of spectrum because of the benefits from the service providers side, in that it helps in making good value of those are able to quickly adapt to consumer needs. From the pricing perspective, we've heard that there's a very important need for regulators and policymakers to adopt a different approach to spectrum pricing. Let the focus be on promoting increased investment in broadband deployment, and also in increased uptake of broadband services, as opposed to the short-term gains in spectrum revenues that are generated from a licensing spectrum. And then lastly, perhaps looking to the future as well, the need to provide adequate enough spectrum for 5G, specifically looking at spectrum in the C-band, where Shergen did highlight the need, the emphasis on the need to make 80 to 100 megahertz available to each operator. So I think in summary, I think those are some of the key takeaways that I might have picked out of there. So thank you very much to all of the panelists who made time to join this, and then thank you everyone as well who's managed to stay this late into the program to listen to us. And we hope that this current travel-related situation with COVID is going to elapse very soon, so that we'll be able to see each other face to face. And I look forward to such a time as well. Thank you very much. And thanks again also to Forum Global as well for the platform. Thank you. Yes, we'll be looking forward to seeing people join GSMA Tribe Africa as well.